September 1939. German forces crossed the Polish border, unleashing a catastrophe that would engulf Europe and the world for 6 long years. The invasion of Poland marked the beginning of World War II, but it also marked the rise of one of the most brutal administrators in Nazi history. His name was Hans Frank, a lawyer, a confidant of Adolf Hitler, and the man who would become known as the Butcher of Poland. This is the story of how an educated man from a middle-class German family transformed into one of the most notorious war criminals of the 20th century. A story of ambition, ideology, and the systematic murder of millions. Hans Michael Frank was born on May 23, 1900, in Karlsruhe, Germany. He was the middle child of 3, born to Karl and Magdalena Frank. His childhood was unremarkable, ordinary even. The Frank family was respectable, middle class, educated. Nothing in his early years suggested the path he would later take. At 17, as World War I raged across Europe, Frank enlisted in the German army. He never saw frontline combat during his years of military service, never experienced the horror of trench warfare that traumatized a generation. Yet his military service proved formative in ways he could not have imagined. It was through his army connections, through the bonds formed in uniform, that Frank would find his political home. In 1919, alongside his military comrades, Frank joined the German Workers' Party at its inception. This obscure political group, meeting in beer halls and small rooms across Munich, would rapidly evolve into something far more sinister: the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Germany in 1919 was a nation in chaos. Defeat in the Great War had brought humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations, hyperinflation, destroyed savings. Political violence erupted in the streets. In this atmosphere of rage and desperation, extremist movements flourished. The Nazi Party offered simple answers to complex problems. It offered scapegoats. It offered the promise of national redemption. Frank officially joined the Nazi Party in September 1923, just 2 months before participating in Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in Munich. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers attempted to seize power in Bavaria. The coup collapsed within hours. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers died in the streets of Munich. Hitler was arrested and imprisoned. Frank fled to Austria to escape arrest. It was a temporary setback. His commitment to the Nazi cause remained unshaken. If anything, the failed putsch strengthened his resolve. He had chosen his side. While in exile, Frank pursued his legal education with determination. By 1926, he had earned his law degree and passed the state examination. His legal credentials, combined with his early loyalty to the movement, caught Adolf Hitler's attention. Frank became Hitler's personal attorney. This was no small achievement. As the Nazi Party grew in power and influence throughout the 1920s, Frank positioned himself as the regime's chief legal mind. He handled the party's legal affairs, defended its members in court, and provided legal justification for its increasingly radical actions. The Nazi Party faced constant legal challenges in the Weimar Republic. Members were arrested for political violence. The party itself faced potential bans. Frank defended them all. He represented more than 2,400 Nazi court cases during these years, building a reputation as a fierce and effective advocate. His most significant trial came in autumn 1930, when he defended 3 Reichswehr officers accused by the German government of Nazi Party membership. At the time, military personnel were forbidden from joining political parties. The trial was sensational, attracting massive media attention across Germany and beyond. Hitler himself testified, using the courtroom as a stage to attack the country's leadership. He declared that the Nazi Party would come to power legally, then create a new German state. Frank's defense strategy was brilliant and cynical. He turned the trial into a propaganda victory for the Nazis, portraying them as patriots persecuted by a corrupt government. The military and the German public began to sympathize with the Nazi movement rather than their own government. It was a turning point, demonstrating the power of legal theater in service of political goals. The trial catapulted Frank into prominence. He was elected to the Reichstag in 1930. By 1933, as Hitler consolidated power and became Chancellor, Frank's loyalty was rewarded. He became Bavaria's Minister of Justice. That same year, he assumed even more prestigious positions: head of the National Socialist Lawyers Association and president of the Academy of German Law. From his influential positions, Frank articulated views that seemed contradictory for a Nazi official. He argued publicly that extrajudicial killings weakened the authority of the German legal system. He even spoke at Dachau concentration camp and various other venues, claiming that unnecessary murders would damage legal institutions and undermine the state's authority. But Frank was no opponent of Nazi ideology. His objections were procedural, not moral. He wanted killing to be systematic, legal, orderly. He made his true position clear when he stated that Nazi judges exist to safeguard the specific order of the racial community, eliminate dangerous elements, prosecute all acts harmful to society, and resolve disputes between community members. National Socialist ideology is the foundation for interpreting legal sources. This was the essence of Nazi legal theory. Law existed not to protect individual rights, but to serve the racial state. Justice meant advancing Aryan supremacy and eliminating those deemed inferior or dangerous. Frank helped build the legal framework for tyranny. Despite claiming some disagreement with aspects of the Nazi program, Frank's primary goal was to fulfill the party's wishes, regardless of his personal reservations. He was a willing instrument of Nazi policy, wrapping terror in legal language, providing bureaucratic justification for atrocity. In 1934, Frank was appointed Reich Minister without portfolio, a title that granted him cabinet rank without specific departmental responsibilities. He continued his ascent through Hitler's regime, accumulating titles and power. By autumn 1939, as German forces invaded Poland, Frank was appointed head of administration under Gerd von Rundstedt, the German military official controlling the regime's rule in occupied Poland. Frank held that position for only 1 month. In October 1939, after Hitler's invasion of Poland was complete, Frank was appointed Governor General of the newly acquired Polish territories. He controlled the general government, those areas of Poland not immediately absorbed into Germany itself, comprising the districts of Warsaw, Lublin, Radom, and Krakow. This promotion gave Frank absolute authority over millions of people. The general government covered approximately 95,000 square kilometers with a population of over 12 million, including 2 million Jews. As long as he adhered to the Führer's desires and Nazi Party principles, Frank could do as he pleased. And what he pleased was monstrous. Frank established his headquarters in Krakow's Wawel Castle, the historic seat of Polish kings. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel, the Nazi lawyer ruling Poland from its most sacred national monument. He lived in luxury while those under his control suffered unimaginable deprivation. Frank used his legal expertise to implement the systematic persecution of Poland's Jewish population. He forced Jewish citizens into ghettos, most notoriously the Warsaw Ghetto, where nearly 500,000 people were crammed into an area of just over 3 square kilometers. Starvation, disease, and overcrowding killed thousands even before the deportations to death camps began. He established forced labor camps throughout the general government, enslaving Polish and Jewish workers for the German war effort. He implemented policies of cultural destruction, closing Polish universities, executing intellectuals, and systematically destroying Polish national identity. The most damning statement of Frank's career came in December 1941. He delivered a speech to his senior officials in the general government. In that speech, Frank clearly explained Hitler's intention to annihilate the entire Jewish people. He outlined the Führer's order to kill all Jews without mercy and without concern. Frank declared, "We must annihilate the Jews wherever we find them." This was not the language of law. This was the language of genocide. In the months and years that followed, Frank presided over 4 of the 6 death camps located in the general government areas of Poland: Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Sobibor. These names have become synonymous with industrial-scale murder. At Belzec, approximately 600,000 people were killed between March and December 1942. The camp had no other purpose. It existed solely for murder. At Treblinka, between 700,000 and 900,000 people were murdered, most between July 1942 and October 1943. At Sobibor, roughly 250,000 people were killed at Majdanek. An estimated 80,000 perished. The majority were Jews, but the victims also included Poles, Roma, and Soviet prisoners of war. They arrived in cattle cars, were stripped of their possessions, and were murdered within hours. Their bodies were burned. Their belongings were sorted and shipped to Germany. The killing was systematic, bureaucratic, efficient. Frank's role was administrative, bureaucratic, legal. He did not personally operate gas chambers or pull triggers, but his orders, his policies, his administration made the killing possible. He created the legal framework for genocide. He signed the decrees. He provided the resources. He removed the obstacles. In his domain, Frank also oversaw the execution of Polish intellectuals, resistance fighters, and anyone deemed dangerous to German rule. The AB action in 1940 targeted Polish elites for extermination. Teachers, priests, doctors, lawyers, approximately 6,000 were murdered in this operation alone. Frank kept meticulous records of his activities. His diaries, running to 42 volumes, documented his administration of the general government. They recorded his meetings, his decisions, his speeches. These diaries would later become crucial evidence of his crimes. In subsequent years and investigations, Frank claimed he had nothing to do with the extermination of the Jewish people. These claims were lies. He was ultimately found guilty of complicity in the Nazi cause after the war because of his direct involvement in these efforts. The documentary evidence was overwhelming. Despite his work advancing the Nazi program in the general government of Poland, Frank did not maintain Hitler's favor throughout his career. By 1942, Frank had become an unwelcome presence in Nazi circles. The reasons were complex and revealing. He angered Hitler by speaking in German cities across the country, criticizing the head of the SS and police in the general government. He complained about SS interference in his administration, about corruption, about the chaos of competing Nazi agencies. It was an unusual act of defiance from a man who had spent his career following orders. Frank also made speeches calling for a return to law and order, criticizing the arbitrary exercise of power. This was remarkable hypocrisy from the man overseeing mass murder, but it reflected internal Nazi power struggles rather than any genuine moral awakening. Hitler summoned Frank and demanded his resignation from all party positions. Frank lost his titles as Reich Law Leader and President of the Academy of German Law. But Hitler would not permit him to resign from his role as Governor General. He was trapped in his position, politically neutered but administratively responsible for territories drowning in blood. Frank remained Governor General until the end, presiding over the final collapse of Nazi power in Poland. As the end of the war approached in 1945, Frank attempted to flee the advancing Soviet army in January. He left Krakow as Soviet forces approached. Taking with him his 42 volumes of diaries, the notorious Nazi was not on the run for long. Just 4 months after his escape attempt, on May 4, 1945, American troops captured Frank in his villa near Lake Schliersee in southern Bavaria. Like many other Nazi supporters and vicious leaders, he was forced to run a gauntlet of American soldiers who beat him. Frank collapsed under this pressure, unable to endure the thought of even harsher treatment, facing the judgment of those whose people he had murdered. He attempted suicide by slashing his throat. When that attempt failed, he tried again just 48 hours later, ineffectively cutting his left wrist. Frank could not escape what he had earned as the notorious Butcher of Poland. He was charged with war crimes and brought before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in November 1945, along with 21 other major Nazi leaders. Frank's trial lasted 11 months, from November 1945 to October 1946. During this time, he converted to Catholicism, returning to the faith of his childhood. He met regularly with a Catholic chaplain in his cell. Whether this conversion was genuine or calculated remains debated. Perhaps more than any guilt or any other force, his newfound religion compelled Frank to surrender his personal diaries to the Allied forces. This decision sealed his fate. These diaries were devastating evidence. They contained Frank's own record of his activities, his thoughts, his implementation of genocidal policies. The diaries documented meetings where the extermination of Jews was discussed. They recorded Frank's speeches calling for the destruction of Polish culture. They showed his knowledge of and participation in mass murder. Page after page of self-incrimination, written in Frank's own hand. Repentant and grieving over the crimes he committed, Frank was one of only 2 Nazi officials at Nuremberg who showed any remorse for what he had done as a supporter of Hitler. The other was Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister. Frank testified, "1,000 years will pass and still this guilt of Germany will not have been erased." He accepted responsibility, though no amount of remorse could balance the scales of justice or restore the dead. But his contrition was selective. He claimed ignorance of the full extent of the Holocaust, despite the evidence in his own diaries. He portrayed himself as a functionary who followed orders, not an architect of genocide the judges saw through these evasions. On October 1, 1946, Frank's lengthy trial concluded. After months of testimony, evidence, and deliberation, the verdict was announced. Frank was found guilty on 2 counts: war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was acquitted on the count of crimes against peace. The judgment stated, Frank was a willing and knowing participant in the use of terrorism in Poland, in the economic exploitation of Poland in a way which led to the death by starvation of a large number of people, in the deportation to Germany as slave laborers of over 1 million Poles, and in a program involving the murder of at least 3 million Jews. The sentence was death by hanging. The verdict was inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming. Frank showed no surprise when the sentence was pronounced. Just over 2 weeks later, on October 16, 1946, Hans Frank was executed by hanging at Nuremberg prison. His last words were reported as, "I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity, and I ask God to accept me with mercy." He faced death with the religious conviction he had found in his final months. But religious conversion at the end of life cannot erase years of willing participation in genocide. Frank died as he had lived for much of his adult life, in service to an evil ideology. His body was cremated, the ashes scattered in a river so that no grave could become a shrine for Nazi sympathizers. Today, Hans Frank is remembered for killing countless Polish citizens and countless Jews, all murdered because this Nazi official chose to follow his German dictator, a lawyer who counseled one of the greatest evils in history. Frank left behind a legacy stained with the blood of millions. The Nuremberg military tribunal found Hans Frank guilty of his crimes. History has proven that his deeds were too evil, too terrible to call him anything other than the Butcher of Poland. But perhaps no testimony is more fitting than that of Frank's own son, Nicholas. Many decades after his father's death, Nicholas Frank published a book about Hans Frank's life titled In the Shadow of the Reich. The son of the great Nazi called his father a slime of a Hitler fanatic, leaving the public no doubt about how Hans Frank should be remembered. Nicholas Frank dedicated his life to confronting his father's crimes, giving lectures, writing books, refusing to allow the world to forget. He represents a different choice, the choice to acknowledge evil, to reject it, to ensure it is remembered so it might never be repeated. The story of Hans Frank forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Educated, intelligent people are capable of monstrous evil. Frank was not an ignorant brute. He was a lawyer, an administrator, a man who understood law and order, who had studied jurisprudence and legal philosophy. Yet he used his education and his position to facilitate mass murder on an unimaginable scale. He wrapped genocide in legal language. He turned the machinery of government into an instrument of death. He proved that intelligence without morality is not just worthless, it is dangerous. Frank's transformation from a middle-class German child to the Butcher of Poland demonstrates how ideology can corrupt, how power can blind, and how the choice to follow orders can lead to the depths of human depravity. His execution at Nuremberg was justice, but it could not restore the lives he destroyed. It could not rebuild the communities he annihilated. It could not return the children he sent to gas chambers. Justice can punish the guilty, but it cannot resurrect the dead. Hans Frank died in 1946, but the consequences of his actions echo through generations. The survivors who carry the trauma, the descendants who inherit the loss, the historical record that bears witness, all testify to what one man with legal authority and Nazi ideology could accomplish. This is why we remember, this is why we study these dark chapters of history. Not to glorify the perpetrators, but to understand how such evil becomes possible, to recognize the warning signs, to identify the structures that enable genocide, to resist the ideologies that dehumanize and destroy. Hans Frank, the Butcher of Poland, serves as a permanent reminder that education without ethics, intelligence without morality, and law without justice can become tools of genocide. The victims of his crimes deserve to be remembered. Their names, their lives, their humanity must not be erased by the enormity of the statistics: 3 million Jews, hundreds of thousands of Poles, each one an individual with dreams and families and futures that were stolen. We remember so that it never happens again.